Hi everyone, welcome back to this afternoon session. The first session this afternoon, Proxies and Models in Climate Research, will be chaired by Margaret Steenshorst-Dotter and Torsten Maritsen. Welcome.
Yeah. Hello everyone. I hope I'm allowed to say that this session is co-hosted between RA1 and RA6. And we have, in these two research areas, we have an enormous range of subjects, I would say. Everything from chemical markers in sediments that are many hundred million years old, fossil plants and animals of all kinds of, from, again, hundreds of millions of years old, and through modern time and to modeling of future climate change. And I think our session today is going to present all of this range pretty well. We will start with 250-million-year-old pollen and what they can tell us about climate change, and go through to the Eocene or Oligocene, about 34 million years old, and then we will go more into the kind of modeling modern time and future perspective using climate models. So I'd like to introduce Natasha Barbolini, who is in the Deep Department at Stockholm University and also has collaborations with us at the Natural History Museum. And she will talk about fossil pollen and if they have been a climate proxy for dry global environment since the Permian. Go ahead, Natasha.
So I'm going to tell you about Ephedra pieties, which is this pollen grain that I have been studying, which has a very long time record. And this is the plant that produced it. So this is Ephedra. It belongs to the group Nyctales, which is a very poorly understood group of gymnosperms. Ephedra grows primarily as a shrub today. But when we think of gymnosperms, we think more of things like this, right? Conifers that produce a lot of pollen sometimes. That is wind pollinated. But Ephedra is actually quite different, and its pollination biology is unique. So it produces three different kinds of pollen. So we refer to Ephedra the plant and Ephedra pieties the pollen grains, going back into the fossil record, because you don't always know if the plant and the pollen are associated. And you have these three different kinds of pollen grains, which are easy to recognize. And the older type, the ancestral type, we know can be pollinated either by insects or by wind. But then we have these two derived types, which only start evolving in the Paleogene. And we know that they are exclusively wind pollinated. And so this gives us at least a time frame for the shift of the pollination. But what this has done has enabled us to constrain the phylogeny of Ephedra much better, and of the Nyctales as a whole. So now we know that insect pollination was actually the ancestral condition for the ephedroids. And now the core Ephedra group that live today are essentially wind pollinated. And so we have different species of Ephedra growing today that belong to these two different pollination modes. But as you can see, they are essentially identical. It's practically impossible to tell them apart in the field. And it's also difficult to relate their pollen grains to the living plants. So going back in the fossil record, Ephedra has a particularly long fossil history. In terms of the fossil plants that you find, they actually belong really exclusively to this period in the Lower Cretaceous, where you see a huge diversity of ephedroids. And after that, you simply have a ghost lineage where no fossil plants are produced, but as they are living today, we know that they must have survived. If you include these putative meteophytes, like this one from the late Permian of China, which is associated with a lot of Ephedra pieties pollen, that could extend the ghost record of ephedroids all the way back to the late Permian, but it's unlikely that we will ever be able to conclusively prove that things like this were ephedroids or Nyctalians. Although interestingly, the pollen record of Ephedra also stretches back to the late Permian, and these are some really nice Nyctalian pollen grains from South Africa that I've recovered. And these are called Ephedra pieties, in inverted commas, in the stratigraphy, but it's once again difficult to prove that these can be related to the living plants of Ephedra. It's probably unlikely. There were multiple plant groups at that time that were producing grains that looked like this. But in terms of using ephedra pieties specifically for deep calm climates, there are multiple reasons why I've chosen to pursue this possibility. Of course, we need to improve the record of continental temperatures through time against the much better established marine record. And pollen is often ubiquitously found in a variety of depositional environments and through a very long time range. And the other advantage of pollen, of course, is that it can also tell us at the same time as analyzing it a lot of information on vegetation changes as well as possible climate changes. So ephedra pieties in particular is a useful proxy if we're going to pick any pollen grain. First of all, because it's a non-saccate grain. So unlike the conifer pollen that I showed you earlier, which here is an image over here under SEM of what that looks like, you can see it has these large two sacci or bladders, which really help the pollen grain to be transported well under wind conditions. But ephedra is not like that. So we know that it is going to be reflecting more local conditions instead of being transported so far. In particular, the insect-pollinated grains are going to be traveling less far than the wind-pollinated grains. That has been shown in a number of other aerodynamic studies that I will not talk about. And we know, as I've just shown you, that ephedra pieties has a particularly long fossil record. We have the single taxon with a very long fossil record. And because we're only using this one taxon, it avoids problems with artificial mixing of different taxa in regional pollen assemblages. So what has happened in the past using different plant-based methods to reconstruct paleoclimate, one approach has been to take a lot of different pollen taxa that you find in a single assemblage and use their mutual climatic range, which is shown here by the yellow, or overlapping in order to indicate climate. But there's certain problems with this method, and one of them involves that in a normal pollen assemblage, you are getting taxa that come from a variety of different environments. And so here you can be artificially putting two taxa against each other that would never have coexisted. And so you'll come up with an artificial climatic range for that. There's another method, I should say that this method relies on the assumption that the climatic requirements of a fossil plant are going to be similar to those of the nearest living relative. But in this project, I don't want to assume that. I want to independently test that. So another method that's been used to reconstruct paleoclimates, which is very good because it's independent of taxonomy, so it doesn't rely on this nearest living relative approach. It's a physiognomic method called CLAMP, so Climate Leaf Analysis Multivariate Program. And so what this does is it looks at the physiognomic shapes of fossil leaves of woody angiosperms. And this actually gives us quite a well-resolved climate going back in time as well. The problem is first of all, it relies only on angiosperms. It doesn't work for other plant groups. And so if you don't have angiosperms in your fossil record, you're not going to be able to use this method. And even in Cenozoic records, where angiosperms, of course, are already very common, sometimes you can have preservation of plant material that looks like this. And this is the typical preservation for all of the Central Asian sites that I work on. So it's impossible to use CLAMP in these situations. What we're doing is using a somewhat different approach, a phylomorphogenetic approach, if you will, and looking at the living species of ephedra. So those are all listed at the top. You don't need to read the names. Because we now have this very well-resolved phylogeny of the ephedrales as a whole, we can look at the different environments in which they grow today, and we can infer those conditions going back in time. So if we look first at the temperatures in which ephedra lives in, you can see that the ancestral plants, which are shown here to the left, these are in the warmer colors, and they exist in warmer temperatures today. And the ancestral type is common specifically in climates with the warm month mean temperature above 22 degrees. And looking back in time, we can also see a very clear correlation between warmer climates and the ancestral type. So in the more derived types of ephedra, they have evolved this increasing cold tolerance as we go through time. But you can see that essentially with only those two lineages over there in dark blue, essentially this is a warmer liking plant. Switching over to precipitation, in the environment, we can see here that ephedra, at least living ephedra, all occupy quite dry habitats today, and that they have probably done so in the past. The question is, what span of time does this phylogeny actually represent? When did these species split off, the ancestral type producing these more derived types? And this is quite a difficult evolutionary question, actually. So there were previous molecular analyses that pointed the diversification of ephedrales to the earliest Oligocene, and that makes a lot of sense because, as you see, the derived types have evolved cold tolerance, and we know there was rapid climate cooling at the Eocene Oligocene boundary. So that made sense. However, these new analyses, which have just been submitted for publication, they show that the timing is actually really uncertain, and it could be really old ages or really young ages based only on molecular data. So we need to resolve this in order to understand how old the crown group really is. And fossil pollen is most likely to provide a calibration point for this. And so that is part of what I'm working on right now. What I also know is that the biogeography makes either very old or very young ages for the crown group unlikely. And so that this evolutionary group probably represents maybe 35 to 50 million years of time span. So that is useful, but of course, it needs more work in resolving how long ephedra has really lived in these habitats for. So we know that today it correlates strongly with precipitation and temperature, but of course this is more complicated going back in deep time. First of all, we can't distinguish the extant and the fossil grains as well to species level on their morphology. So this is a problem in the fossil record where you find them separated. And as I've just shown you, the age of the crown group ephedra remains uncertain. So we're not sure how long these climatic tolerance envelopes have actually been conserved for. I'm aiming to address these issues with the help of the Bolin Center, and this will hopefully improve the potential of using ephedra parties as a deep climate proxy. And so one of the ways I'm doing this is using Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy to characterize the chemical composition of living and fossil plant remains. And this technique has been proven to differentiate pollen, in fact, in spores. Spores as old as 400 million years. So that gives us confidence that the technique will work applied to the ephedroids. And interestingly, for the living plant groups, there's a very nice clear spectral separation between the eudicots, the monodicots, and the conifers, but it hasn't been done for the ephedroids. So these are on the left, these chemical characterization of different pollen grains, and they are giving unique chemical spectra by which we can link the pollen grains to their parent plants. And so this is something that I recently went to do in the Netherlands. The Bolin Center provided that funding, so I'm very grateful for that, and I'm currently analyzing the spectra, so hopefully we're going to get some good results. So in the future, what I'm planning to do, for now, we know that ephedra occupies very seasonal habitats today, and that it has a lot of promise as a deep time climate proxy, but it requires verification in multiple deep time settings. The derived type can tolerate cold, whereas the ancestral type likes warm climates. And so our next step will be to start linking independent proxies like sedimentology and other temperature records with ephedra parties in the geological record globally. So those are my future plans, and I'd like to acknowledge the Bolin Center for my trip here. I am analyzing these spectra, and also this is done in the context of my project with Papalinga Din, looking at the aerodynamics of the ephedra. And now we'll take any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Natasha. It's really interesting. Any questions or comments for Natasha? 1 minute.
So how is this seems like a fairly new technique. Do you know how general it may be that you can get down to the species level with the chemical signature when you're not able to with morphology?
So it's worked really well for grasses. That paper came out 2 years ago, but it's just starting to really be applied now to actually characterize. And then we've done it for a variety of deep time grasses, as well as conifer pollen, and then some other angiosperms. And we're getting quite promising results. So yeah, this is a really new technique, but so far it seems to be, holding a lot of promise.
Okay, I think we have to move on. Thanks very much, Natasha.
Sorry, I must there is some more time.
Ah, that's what I meant. I thought it meant change over now. A quick question more? Yep.
Thanks, Natasha, for an interesting talk. Obviously, constraining terrestrial temperatures is really a really great thing to do, and it's trickier to do than in the marine records. So do these type of plants fill in any particular sort of gaps in coverage spatially we haven't had, say, for the Cenozoic? Where do they help?
Well, definitely for the Central Asian continental interior, that fills a really nice gap there. There have been some results from clumped isotopes, from carbonates. So what's actually nice is because ephedra is really common in Central Asia, having been so dry and seasonal, we can compare the results that we're getting from the carbonates with ephedra pardii, so we can be sure that we're not just inferring. So this could actually provide a really nice confirmation, and then we could apply it to other, yeah.
Cool. Move on. Thanks very much. Again, Natasha. We'll move on to David Hutchinson, who is our RA1, RA6 poster boy. And he will talk about his new article out about Arctic closure as a trigger for Atlantic overturning at the Eocene-Oligocene transition.
Matt Regan, Johan Nilsson, and Rodrigo Caballero. And also, I've had support from RA1, RA6, and various travel grants. So I had a lot of support from the Bolin Center. So thank you. So just to introduce you to the Eocene-Oligocene transition. So prior to 34 million years, we had this warm greenhouse climate, very high CO2, certainly above 1,000 parts per million in the warmest parts. No ice caps anywhere on Earth. And a gradual kind of cooling from this peak at 55, gradually cooling down, CO2 gradually coming down until you reach this sharp transition towards a colder climate here at the Eocene-Oligocene transition. And that's when the Antarctic ice sheet first formed. Just a unipolar glaciation, we think, not so much in the northern hemisphere. And global changes in flora and fauna in both marine and terrestrial environments. And it's thought that CO2 was a strong driver of that, but there's also a number of ways that the ocean circulation changed at that time and perhaps were also contributing to that cooling. So there's been quite some discussion over the years about the Southern Ocean gateways and driving those changes. We're looking at a different angle there, and it's actually the northern gateways in between the Arctic and Atlantic and how that might have affected the ocean circulation. Okay, so to run you through a picture of what we think the Atlantic meridional overturning looked like from the early Eocene, back at this time we think it was dominated by southern sinking, not much sinking at all in the north. As we move forwards in time to the kind of late Eocene, we're getting at the beginning of some North Atlantic intermediate water. We continue to have southern sinking through this whole time, but this North Atlantic deep water formation starts to deepen and go further south, roughly around the Eocene-Oligocene transition. This picture comes from a big compilation of Delta 18O and Delta 13C proxies. So this is kind of the best we can do from those proxies. And more recent work by Helen Coxell et al. 2018 found that in the Labrador Sea, the deep water was getting saltier in the lead up to the Eocene-Oligocene transition and also getting denser and cooler. Now this curve here, there's two curves here. So this is two different ways of reconstructing the salinity in the North Atlantic. There's quite some spread in terms of the absolute numbers, and that's because salinity is really hard to constrain back then. But both of those calibrations show you an increase in salinity quite substantially from a few million years before the transition and continuing into after the transition. But there's a suggestion there that this North Atlantic water mass was getting saltier, which then, of course, makes it more conducive to sinking. By the way, this kind of salinity estimate, I think, really rare to see this in the literature because it is so hard to constrain. I think we need more of that as a modeler, we need more salinity estimates. So, yeah. So at the same time, we have independent proxies from neodymium isotopes, which suggest that the Pacific was undergoing deep water formation in both the north and the south. So from 70 to 36 million years ago, these neodymium isotopes indicate bipolar sinking in the Pacific. And then from 36 million years, a gradual shutdown in Pacific deep water. So this is independent evidence. As far as I can tell, these authors really didn't see any of the other work that I referred to. And yet there's perhaps a connection here because you have salt advection feedback between the basins, which lead to a competition between sinking from one basin and the other. So perhaps the salinity balance between the Pacific and Atlantic was critical in this transition. That's certainly what we try to show in our modeling. So to investigate this, we set up a new model of the late Eocene based on the DFDL CM2.1 climate model. We did some customization, changed the grid a little bit so that we had a 1 degree ocean coupled to a 3 degree atmosphere. It was deliberately done so that we could have good resolution of ocean gateways with regard to this kind of time period of modeling and a relatively fast running model, so with a low resolution atmosphere. And this took some time to set up. There's a bit of a story there. Some things went wrong, but eventually we got some nice results. So this is our climatology from the late Eocene. This is a 6,500 year simulation. It does a reasonably good job of simulating our late Eocene sea surface temperature. I haven't actually got the proxy comparison here, but the temperature gradient is not too bad in terms of lining up the proxies. It's not perfect, but you know, for instance, Southern Ocean is 15, 20 degrees near the coast of Antarctica on the annual mean. The Arctic is around 5, and at the equator we've got sort of 35. Now, what came out quite strongly in just about every time we tried to run this was that we got very fresh Arctic Ocean, something like 20 PSU at the surface. And because of this connection between the Arctic and the Atlantic, you had this kind of outflow of fresh water. So a lot of runoff and precipitation, right? It's causing this freshwater layer here in the Arctic. And that runoff tends to sit a little higher than the rest of the sea surface, and so it flows out into the North Atlantic. And you're left with a water mass here which is just way too fresh to be able to sustain any kind of deep water. So if you have evidence from the proxy record that you've got Atlantic deep water starting up at the EOT, you need to somehow have a way of changing that salinity. But this is kind of the best we have of Arctic salinity in the Eocene. So this age is from like 52 to 46 or 44, and there's quite a spread here of what the Arctic surface salinities look like from fishbone estimates. But yeah, 20 to 25 is roughly what they've estimated, and then these kind of sharp excursions every now and then, which suggests that you had a dip in salinity every now and then, probably caused by periodic isolation of the Arctic. So as the Arctic becomes more isolated from the rest of the ocean, it then can fill up with more fresh water. So unfortunately, there's a large hiatus in this record around the EOT from 44 to 18 million years, and there's a new expedition which is being planned to try and fill that gap. But you have also independent evidence from the Barents Sea, like a very detailed couple of studies looking at seismic data, looking at the kind of sediments that you have in this region, which suggests that you had a connection in the sort of early mid-Eocene between the Arctic and the North Atlantic, and that gradually closed up. So that outflow that we're talking about, which brought that fresh water into the North Atlantic, probably shut. And the timing of that is, you know, a little bit hard to constrain, but there is some evidence that perhaps there's one study in particular which suggests that the Arctic became isolated right at the EOT. So there's some evidence to say that this could have been a factor in causing that salinity to change. So if we run this in our model, we have this picture here where we have this very fresh Arctic Ocean, again, caused by runoff and precipitation minus evaporation. We have the transport of that fresh water into the North Atlantic, which makes this region also relatively fresh. And in this scenario, we get North Pacific sinking. We also get Southern Ocean sinking the whole way, but this outflow of the Arctic prevents any kind of sinking. So this picture here is the mixed layer depth in the winter, And anyway, where you have these like yellow, purple colors, that's where you have very deep mixed layers which indicate deep water formation. When we close that gateway between the Arctic and the North Atlantic, suddenly our salinities increase rapidly, well, dramatically in the North Atlantic, and then suddenly we get North Atlantic sinking and a shutdown of North Pacific sinking. So this could be a switch between one mode of sinking and another. And just to show you what that looks like in terms of stream function, it's very strong Pacific sinking in our control case, virtually nothing in the Atlantic. Once we close that gateway, once we shut off that freshwater transport, that sinking then shifts across to the Atlantic and it dies in the Pacific. And so what we found actually is what caused that change is this transport of salt. This is a salt transport stream function with some vectors overlaid. And it's a bit hard to see, but there's a substantial outflow of salinity from the Atlantic to the Pacific in our control case. And when we shut off that gateway, we more or less stop the transport through the Panama Gateway. Even though this gateway remains open, there's a salt advection feedback from the overturning in the Atlantic, which then stops salinity from getting into the Pacific. And instead, that salt transport is drawn further south in the North Pacific. So the upshot is that you lose your Pacific sinking at the same time as you start your Atlantic sinking. Right, so that's the crux of what we found. So our late Eocene control run, we have very low salinity in the North Atlantic, which prevents sinking. Closure of that Arctic Atlantic gateway greatly increases Atlantic salinity and may trigger the North Atlantic. And importantly, this switch from the Atlantic to Pacific to the Atlantic is supported by independent proxies from both oceans, which is, I think it's pretty exciting to have a model that agrees with multiple proxies from different places. So this is published recently in Nature Communications, and yeah.
Thanks, David, for a great talk. Questions for David?
When you have a freshwater cap in the Arctic, it's very easy to form sea ice in the wintertime. So I was wondering whether this model actually does form winter sea ice, and whether there are any proxies that say whether or not that's a problem.
Yeah, so we do get winter sea ice in our control run, but not very much at our 800 parts per million level. When we go down to 400 parts per million, then yes, we got a lot of winter sea ice, but it's very seasonal. It melts away in the summer, kind of thing. So it wouldn't support ice formation in the northern hemisphere, I don't think. I think the proxy evidence is, it's a little thin, but there is, perhaps some sea ice forming in the Eocene, like winter sea ice. So I don't think we can say exactly which case is the best in terms of levels of CO2.
And I don't think you mentioned this business of the cores and the Eocene cores in the Arctic with these great blooms of azolla, this kind of brackish water. Does that that actually confirm this or line up correctly with this? Yeah,
so that's exactly these excursions, 1, 2, and 3 on this graph. They're azolla events. I probably should have mentioned that, but they are what we've used to infer, what they've used to infer that there's really low salinity. Unfortunately, there's nothing around the EOT. Yeah.
Any more questions for David? No? Over there? No, it's for the streaming.
Does it make do you know if it makes a big difference if you use the Eocene topography compared to the original, the modern topography? Have you tested?
Very much so. So a difference of like 5 degrees or so, about 5 degrees warmer just from the initial boundary conditions. That does include prescribing that there is no ice sheet anywhere, right? So that's built into the boundary conditions that we don't have any Antarctic or Northern Hemisphere ice sheets. it's something to test is how much it's sensitive to the albedo versus the geography. But yeah, it's part of it, definitely.
More questions? If not, then I will ask Daniel to take on the microphone.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm very sick of roads, sorry. There you go. Thanks. Cheers.
So Daniel Belusic from the Met Service. So the next speaker is Daniel from the Met Service. He will talk about why we should resolve clouds. Shut up. Why we should resolve clouds where we live, so to say. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Okay, now shift to very, very small scales. And I usually when you make presentations, you are instructed to, how you say, adjust your presentations to the audience. And I must say, looking at my title, it's not really, because I'm using very, how you say, specific or very detailed terminology, which I shouldn't have done. But I will try to correct that. Anyway, so what I'm talking about here is, if we cross this when, we can say, is convection permitting modeling important here? And I will answer yes. So let's forget about that question. Then we remove the brackets and we say when is. So I will show that. But first, what is convection permitting modeling? So you probably heard if you were here in the very morning, then you heard Anna talking about the GCM CIMIP6 global climate models. And she mentioned very high resolution simulations at 40 kilometers, 40. And when we say convection permitting resolutions, we mean a very, very broad range of resolutions between 2 and 3 kilometers. So basically we are talking about very, very high resolutions. Of course, not a very broad range, I'm just kidding, but it's very high resolution. We are talking about order of magnitude or even 2 orders of magnitude smaller grid spacing in models compared to the typical GCMs, global climate models. And the reason why we do this, I will show soon. But of course, there are problems with this. There is a reason why we use 40 kilometers for very high resolution, or even 80 kilometers or 100 kilometers grid spacing, simply because of the computational resources. So this is very, very expensive, even for regional scales. And we have to be careful when we use them, how we use them. And I'm trying, here we are starting to investigate. This is all very new. One of the figures is from yesterday. But we are starting to investigate when this is important. When should we switch on these models? When we don't need to do that, and so on. This is a collaboration between several institutes, but the specific presentation is between these 4. So it's Norway, Denmark, Finland, and SMHI. And just to say, what is a convection permitting model in this case? Well, the specific one is Harmony Climate, HCLIM, cycle 38, doesn't matter, but it's Harmony Climate. And this is what we develop here at SMHI, plus a number of other countries. So it's a consortium that develops these countries, this model. And we have several different resolutions that we need to cover when we go from a global climate model to very high resolution of, let's say, 1 to 3 kilometers. Then we need an intermediate model, usually at about 10 to 20 kilometers to have a smooth transition, let's say, in resolutions. And we use Aladdin physics there, and for this convection permitting very high resolution, we use AROM. I'm only here stressing that when you hear AROM, I mean 1 to 3 kilometers, so this is convection permitting. And when I say Aladdin, this is the standard regional climate model that had similar physics to global climate model. So in that sense, there is no big difference except for resolution. Here, we call it convection permitting for a reason. Convection permitting means that we don't have to use deep convection parameterization. It means all these storm clouds, which cause strong precipitation, are now dynamically resolved by the model. And this seems to make a very, very, very big change in the model, or we get a very big benefit. Very quickly about the setup of the simulations for those who are interested, we call this experiment NORCP, Nordic Convection Permitting Climate Projections. And these are the domains. The blue one is this 12-kilometer intermediate model, and the red one, which is basically covering the whole of this, it's not the whole Nordic region, but Fennoscandia. It is the 3-kilometer grid spacing, which is this convection permitting. And we run 20-year periods for first downscaling era interim, and then we are downscaling global climate models over 3 different time slices: historical, mid-century, end of century. And currently we have EC Earth downscale. We will downscale GFDL, RCP 8.5. Just to mention one of these 20-year simulations on many hundred of cores takes about 4 months of wall clock time. So in order to finish these 4, it is 4 times 4 months. But that's why we didn't do it alone. But each institute, so Denmark, Finland, Norway, and us, ran one of these simulations, and that's how we managed to do it in 4 months. But it is very time consuming. Okay, now a little bit to talk about the results and why we are doing this. Well, when we look at the daily precipitation, so this is a probability distribution function. So you can see here precipitation intensity daily, very high intensities here. And this is the frequency that these events occur. And we can see that when we go to very high intensities, of course, it is not very frequent. But what do we have? We have era 5. We compare all the stuff to era 5 because it's some sort of truth. It's not really, because this is forecast of precipitation. But it's as good as it gets, I guess. And then we have some other data sets here, which we compare to, and our Arom is red and our Aladdin is blue. And you can see that Aladdin is below, and Arom, this connection permitting, is about, gives higher intensities. When we compare to observations like this NGCD, which is a Nordic gridded climate data set, well, it's somewhere between. Hard to say which one is better. And when we look at the observations in general, so this is just observations plus era 5, you can see that the spread is very large. So one has to be very careful about interpreting results. So not much to see here. But then we go to the real stuff, and this is hourly. So when we go to extreme hourly, and this is convection. Convection happens on sub-daily scales. And here we again see intensity versus frequency, but for hourly events. And here we have era 5 in black, this Aladdin, 12-kilometer in blue, and then we have HIPRAD in green. HIPRAD is the radar, basically radar over Sweden and other here countries, but this is for Sweden now. That is corrected by rain gauges, by observations, and we get a gridded product at 1 kilometer hourly, and this is our Arom. And here you can see that we are talking about really a conceptual shift. Things are changing a lot. Now, if you're an urban planner in Stockholm and you want to know what will happen with your floods in 2090 or 2050, well, you want actually some kind of information like this. You want to know what will happen here. This is what is causing floods. And as you can see, even ERA cannot do this, and you can take ERA as a proxy for a global model. Our typical regional models that are used in Cordex cannot do this. But these new type of models which are now being developed actually are doing this in a much, much, much better way. And this is why we do this. That's the main reason why we run these models. So it seems like just one result in a sense. You can show the whole benefit of these models in one plot, but that's a very, very, very big thing that we get here. And it's really dynamically, conceptually different thing that we are doing with these models. Another way of looking at this is now the 99.9 percentile of hourly precipitation in this 15-year period. And here we see again Aladdin, Arom, and these are the observations from HIPRAD. And I mean, it's pretty clear. And 99.9 of hourly precipitations is what I guess, or so, few events per year, the strongest events per year. So we are getting something really, really different here. We have also done this in a different way. Rather than just taking all precipitation events in that sense, we have done tracking of events. And then we get basically exactly the same thing. But now we can look at event lifetime. Black is observations, red is Arom, blue is this is old school, let's say, regional climate model. Sizes of events, again, red is much closer to black. Max intensity, and any other measure that you look at, we are always seeing this big shift. So this is why it's very useful. This is over the Nordic region, so it all works here. But this was all summer. I haven't mentioned that all these plots that I showed, including this one, are JJA, June, July, August. So it works in summer, it's useful in summer. Is it useful in other places? Well, in other times. Let me just quickly mention one more thing that we really get. Also, again, if we focus only on summer, this is now the mean frequency of precipitation events. And this is one of the main things that we also get in our typical Aladdin, so typical RCMs or GCMs. This is very common, even in reanalysis, that we have very, very large overestimation of frequency of wet days. It means that it drizzles all the time in these models. When you go to this kind of model, this problem disappears. Again, this is all because of this convection being parameterized in typical models. But then, as I said, let's see what happens in winter. And here we are looking at 100 strongest events, precipitating events in our two models. And well, when you look at actually over the land here, one doesn't see much of a difference. But then when you look at over this region here, over the ocean, well, there is quite a lot of difference. But then we looked at this, well, it might not be just the ocean because we have some differences in this region as well. And the purple line here shows the fraction of solid precipitation. So these are isolines of solid precipitation. This is 0.9, 0.6, and so on. And we have noticed that there is actually connection between how much solid precipitation there is in the model and the usefulness or the change that we get with this connection to resolution. So this is the plot from yesterday that I mentioned. And here we actually plot this. So we plot the percentage of solid precipitation in one of the models to the difference, relative difference, so this is percent in precipitation between the two models. Or this is actually the increase of precipitation in this connection from Garon. As you can see, when we have only rain, so no solid precipitation, then we have, for stations that, or for locations that are less than 200 meter high, we have 30, 40 to 20 to 40% increase in precipitation in extreme events. When we go to 100% solid, so basically snow, we get almost no change. So it means that it really is focused on summer or precipitating events which are warm, so rain basically. But this is very initial. We are looking into this a bit more, and I'm just putting this out as something new. Since I don't have much time, I will skip this, but I will just quickly say that when running models, you can also find some interesting things about data, and one always has to be careful about the data. And we looked at ERA 5 comparison with observations and our models for snow. And these are the sites that we used. And here you can see snow depth over a 15-year period. And here you can see the snow, the length of the snow season, number of days. Now for snow depth, all of these curves are, or all of these, whatever, our boxes are pretty much similar, so it's fine. But then when you look at here, there is this gray one, which is always larger than the others, about 20-ish% or more larger than all the others. But believe it or not, this is ERA 5. So ERA 5 snow fraction is not good for Sweden, at least. And we know why. Actually, we have looked into this, but because it's simulating a satellite product which has a problem. But it's just interesting to see because the observations and the models, they're all kind of there, but sometimes there's a reanalysis which we believe in is not so. And in order of, okay, so not to be too long, I will show this. This will be very good. Again, one of these little things that I like to show. This is just for one of these stations looking at snow depth. We looked at station, which is the black one, and then 4 closest grid points from the model. One has to be very careful when comparing to observations, especially station observations and models. Because what you can see here, these are snow depths from 4 closest stations to the observation site. And as you can see, the difference can be threefold. So only one of those chosen ones is really close. And this one is actually vertically closest. So we are now in the complex terrain in mountains. So when choosing which station to which grid point to compare to the observations, if you're doing that, be careful. It can be very, very, very deceiving. And I will just go to the end. So very quickly, we have obvious benefits for summer precipitation, which has been seen in other parts of the world. But for snow and winter, we need more analysis, which is quite interesting for us, of course. So we should know what is happening in winter. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Questions to Daniel?
So as is well known, global mean precipitation increases with temperature more slowly than Clausius-Clapeyron, but there's a general sense that the extremes should increase as rapidly as Clausius-Clapeyron with temperature, or maybe even more rapidly. I was wondering whether you've embedded these high-resolution models within a CMIP global model or something like that to look at how the precipitation extremes change as the world warms.
Yes. Yes, we have done this on a regional scale, of course. And what we see is very interesting, actually. We see at least Clausius-Clapeyron, but in many, many situations we see much more than actually double CC for extremes. But it's not always easy to actually get this scaling right. There is quite a lot of discussion now currently being held in the community, because different types of analysis on the same model outputs give you maybe 1 CC or 2 CC. It's a very, very interesting topic, but we definitely see much more than the global models would give.
Another question there.
Thank you for a nice presentation. I have one question about the wet day frequency analysis you did. I was correct that they have the right amount of water, but instead of having one big convective event, they put you stratiform drizzle all the time.
Yes. If they don't have a bias in precipitation, which is really model dependent, it doesn't depend on the resolution so much actually, and this mean bias, let's say, on daily, monthly precipitation or so on, then it's just the distribution which is shifted to very weak events instead of extreme events. And then with these models, we corrected the distribution. Sometimes overcorrect, sometimes we get more extremes than weak precipitation.
Well, I have another question. Sorry to keep you. Did you look at the diurnal cycle of precipitation? We know from the climate models that they always have the maximum at noon, but in reality it happens later in the day.
Yes, that's the other selling picture that we show, which I haven't really shown here. But of course, when you look at the diurnal cycle, you see, again, it's amazing how well it fits with the observations. So whenever we have observations, which is not so often, but when we do, we see almost perfect fit compared to models, traditional models, which peak at noon. These models tend to peak at, let's say, 3, 4 p.m., depending on where you are, Europe. But if you go to, we did it in Africa or Lake Victoria, there it peaks maybe 6, 7, 8 p.m. or even later, and we pick all this very, very accurately. So it does work.
So let's thank Daniel again. And up next is Marcia, and she will take us up high into the middle atmosphere.
Can there be some pocket or somewhere? Okay. It's working now. Yeah, okay. Okay, my name is Marcia Kouwman. I have been a PhD student at the Department of Meteorology, and currently I'm working at the Department of Physical Geography. I will talk about the last work I did during my PhD, and where I'm also still working on at the moment. So I will talk about climate feedbacks in the middle atmosphere, and specifically how we quantify them. It's work that I've been doing together with Xiong Zhang and Ming Chai, who is in Florida, and Xing Wang. So the first question you can ask, what is actually climate feedback? For many of you already know this, but just to refresh. So climate feedbacks are basically processes in the atmosphere or in the Earth system that can either dampen or amplify initial response to an external perturbation. So you can, for example, think about if we have put CO2 in the atmosphere, adding CO2 in the atmosphere is the external perturbation, and then in response to that, the ice melts and the albedo then decreases, and that again strengthens the warming that you would initially get due to the CO2. So that's an example of a positive feedback. A negative feedback is slowing down this process. So the second question you can ask, what is the middle atmosphere? So if we take a look at the thermal structure of the atmosphere, you see here on the x-axis the temperature, on the y-axis the altitude, and then most of the weather, what we speak about of weather, and most of the mass is in the troposphere, where the temperature is decreasing until the tropopause is reached. Then the temperature starts to increase again due to the ozone that is there in the stratosphere. Above that, we have the mesosphere where the temperature decreases again, and even higher is the mesosphere or the thermosphere. And the region from above the tropopause to the top of the mesosphere, or sometimes even also people include the lower part of the thermosphere into what is referred to as the middle atmosphere. So there are also, when we think about these climate feedbacks, it's maybe you think about processes in the troposphere, but this kind of processes also can happen in higher up in the atmosphere, in the middle atmosphere. So the question is now, how do we study these climate feedbacks? Studying climate feedbacks is actually quite a challenging task. Multiple feedbacks processes can happen at the same time. The responses that you see might not be in equilibrium. The time scales of the forcing might also be different. So there have been lots of methods developed to look at this. And most of these methods, they start from the concept of the top of the atmosphere. So what is drawn there. So that's the idea that the radiative imbalance at this top of the atmosphere causes a change in the surface temperature. But you can also imagine processes that still play a role in determining the climate, but that don't directly affect the top of the atmosphere energy balance. So we use this climate feedback response analyze method, which is a relatively new method that takes into account that the climate change is not only determined by what happens at the top of the atmosphere, but also at energy fluxes within the system itself. And this method then also allows for the isolation of partial temperature changes. So that means that we can really say, like, okay, at this point in the atmosphere, at this latitude, at this height, this much of the temperature change is due to either the direct forcing or a specific feedback. So we wanted to look at the climate feedbacks if we change the CO2 concentration. So we used a high top climate model, the whole atmosphere community climate model, WACCM, where we did 4 experiments. We used the pre-industrial experiment where we put the CO2 concentration at 280 ppmv and where we prescribed the sea surface temperature SST and the ice as pre-industrial. Then we did a run where we changed both the CO2 concentration and the sea surface temperature. And then we had 2 runs where we either only changed the sea surface temperature or the CO2 concentration. And then we see here, all the results that I show here are for July. So these are the temperature responses in the double CO2 scenario. So the picture here on the left shows the temperature changes in the atmosphere for both the changes in CO2 and sea surface temperature. And you see that while in the troposphere, the lower part of the atmosphere is actually warming, in the middle atmosphere, the atmosphere is cooling, apart from 2 regions there. The middle one shows the temperature response for only changing the CO2. The one on the right shows the temperature response to the changes in sea surface temperature. So we see that, that if we add up only changing CO2 or only changing sea surface temperature gives us this one. So if we add these 2, and that we can also understand because the temperature changes there are caused either by changes in radiation, which is due to the CO2, or changes in the wave forcing, which is caused by changes in the sea surface temperature. Our question was now, where do these temperature changes come from? And then we used our methods. And we see here the results. So here you see the temperature response to either, this is the total temperature change, to the direct forcing, and all these are different climate feedback. So we have the climate due to ozone, water vapor, cloud, albedo, and a dynamical feedback, and we have here a non-local thermal equilibrium term that we needed for our calculations, but actually is not so big. So we see then that the direct forcing due to CO2 is almost 9 degrees in the global mean. Here I forgot actually to put that here. In the blue, let's only look at the blue, that's the global mean, and then I also looked at the tropics and the polar regions, but let's look at the blue one, the global mean one. Then you see that the cooling due to the direct forcing of CO2 is almost 9 degrees, while you look at the total temperature change, it's much smaller. So that means that the climate feedback processes in the middle atmosphere are actually mitigating this cooling. And the biggest contributor to this mitigation is here the ozone feedback. So that means that the ozone concentrations are changing in such a way that they will actually warm the middle atmosphere. And we also see that the clouds, albedo feedback and the water vapor feedback, which are important in the troposphere, actually don't play such a big role in the middle atmosphere. We also had this experiment where we changed only the CO2 and only the sea surface temperature, and we performed the calculations on those as well. And then you see that actually the responses to only changing the CO2 sea surface temperatures are relatively small compared to the changes in CO2. So it's really the CO2 that makes the biggest difference. Although the water vapor feedback here is rather small, but is only due to changes in sea surface temperature. So how can we understand why the ozone is changing? So here you see a picture of the circulation in the middle atmosphere. So you have here the summer pole, the winter pole, and here you have the altitude, and you see in the stratosphere the air is transported from the equator to the polar regions, while in the mesopoles it goes from the summer to the winter pole. And we see that if we increase the CO2 concentration, we get a stronger pole-to-pole flow in the mesosphere. And then if we look at the temperature response to this, then we indeed see that we here get a cooling, which can be understood because we have more upwelling there, and here we get a warming, we have more downwelling there. So that makes sense. And from this we can also understand how the ozone concentration is changing. So in most of the middle atmosphere, the ozone concentration is increasing. That has to do with the chemistry, which is temperature dependent. And because of the dynamics, we can also understand that there are regions where it is decreasing because there's more ozone depleting substances going down. And this, then with this, we can calculate what the response to that is temperature-wise. So where we see that the ozone is increasing, we also see a warming. So it follows the CO2 of the ozone concentration. Here in the winter polar region, there's no sunlight, so we also don't see a temperature response there. So we can conclude that in a double CO2 climate, the middle atmosphere is being cooled, and this cooling is being mitigated by the combined effect of these different feedback processes, the most important one being ozone, which actually leads to a warming. The effects of the sea surface temperatures are rather small in this region. And we also see that the clouds and the water vapor and the albedo feedback, which are important in the troposphere, are actually not so important in the middle atmosphere. And you can of course wonder why do we care about this? This is all high up in the atmosphere. So the next step would be, what is then the influence of this ozone feedback on the surface climates? And in recent years, a couple of papers have come out of this topic. This is a paper from 2015, one of the earlier ones that was published in Nature. And there they used, they did an experiment where they multiplied the CO2 concentration with, by 4. They used, here, the green line, they used the CO2 concentration from the pre-industrial run. And from the red line, they let it vary. And you can see if you don't change the ozone, the temperature change is quite significantly higher than if you do let the ozone change. So if you do let the ozone change, you get here a difference of more than 1 degree. So that's more than 20% of the temperature response. So that means that if you take into account this ozone feedback that we see in the middle atmosphere, then the temperature changes at the surface would be significantly smaller. However, different papers and different models have found different effects of this. So it's something that definitely needs a lot of more research.
Thank you, Marta. Question to Marta?
This is very interesting. If you think about the reason why you have these differences, could it be that so much heat is trapped in a high carbon dioxide world? So much heat is trapped in the lower atmosphere that is not released to the middle atmosphere? Or is it another reason?
I'm not sure if I completely understand your question. So the question is why the middle atmosphere cools? Oh, okay. Yeah, so if we add CO2 in the atmosphere, in the middle atmosphere, in the troposphere, this leads to a warming, but in the middle atmosphere, this actually leads to a cooling because you change the radiative balance. So you actually get more. There is a very nice paper about that kind of compares it to this blanket where you get more energy that goes out instead of in, while in the troposphere it's the other way around. So it's kind of hard to imagine, but it works the other way around in the middle atmosphere. Yeah.
It is interesting that changing the surface temperature by 2 degrees so little effect on the middle atmosphere temperature, especially given that you have vertical amplification of the surface signal as up to the tropopause, or so by the moist adiabat. So the two things that actually heat the middle atmosphere are ozone heating and upwelling infrared.
Mm-hmm.
The upwelling infrared is mostly depleted in the infrared where CO2 absorbs very well, but it's still one of the main terms. I'm wondering if you've diagnosed the energy budget of the middle atmosphere, see whether see how the ozone heating compares with the heating from the heating from the upwelling atmospheric infrared. Because one interpretation of these results is that the ozone heating is actually dominating. It's actually dominating the heat source for the atmosphere. The changes in the upwelling IR are just not that big.
Right. I mean, we do see still a cooling in the middle atmosphere, but due to the changes in the ozone concentration, we see that would counteract that. And yeah, I mean, ozone is definitely the most important heat source in the middle atmosphere. So yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so the next speaker is Klaus, and he will take us to the...
Yeah, well, we will end up in the future, right? Okay, good. So it's just me between, me before the coffee. So let's do that here. I will talk about the future climate projections that we did with the Easy Earth model in this specific configuration, and this is all part of CMIP6. And I just put my name here, but of course this is not a one-man show. This is a lot of collaboration within the SMHI, the Rossby Center, Bolin Center, and also the Easy Earth community, of course. So, but if you have any questions, so you can ask me or send me an email later on. Okay, Anna has already introduced the CMIP6 project, and so I can skip most of that, what I want to say here, but just to remind you that CMIP6 is much more than just future climate scenarios. So it's a lot of MIPS and experiments and a lot of very academic studies on changing small things, sensitivity studies with climate models and everything. But future climate projections or climate scenarios are of course a very important part, and that's probably what is mostly debated in the general public, and the most or the outcome that is mostly discussed in the newspapers or wherever you talk about climate and how will the climate look like in the future. And so I will talk today about our results that we have achieved, and this is as part of the scenario MIP experiments that we did. Good. So how does it look like? Well, this is a plot that summarizes our historical experiments. So before we can do the future scenarios, of course, you have to make a historical experiment. And the reason why we do that is the climate model needs to be spun up as we call it. So it has to be in balance with its environment. If we would just take a climate model and start it today, it would drift terribly, so it would not be very reliable to look at that. So that's the reason why we start all our climate experiments already at pre-industrial times. And pre-industrial times here means we started in 1850. That's what what the CMIP6 protocol says, what all climate models are doing. So we all started in 1850, and then we let the model evolve, and we, I mean, it's just a physical model, so it has a lot of physics and equations in it, and we let it go. And the only thing we do is we change the forcing, and the forcing is changed here according to observation. So we know how greenhouse gases have changed, we know how aerosols have changed over the last 150 or so years, and we put all that information into the forcing, and so and then we can look how the model evolves, and we can compare that against observations. And what I show you here in the black line is kind of the mean of 6 different model experiments that we did. The gray area shows the entire range of these model experiments, so what we call an ensemble. And the red line is era 20C. It's a reanalysis of the 20th century, and it's just the global mean temperature. And we see if we take the average model, it agrees very nicely with the reanalysis of the last century. But of course, we also see that individual realizations, as we call them, or individual members of this experiment, they scatter quite widely around the ensemble mean. So the range is rather big. And this was kind of a surprise, because the variability in the model seems to be so high compared to what we would expect maybe, or what we have seen before. And this is one of the things that we have to analyze further. I mean, why is our variability so big in the model? And is it realistic or not? Or is it, maybe it's too big? We don't know yet. Okay, so the next problem, skip. But when we go into the future, now it comes this question of scenarios. And one of the big changes between CMIP5, what has been used before, and for the last IPCC assessment report, where everybody talks about these RCPs, these reference concentration pathways, we are now going to SSPs, which are called shared socioeconomic pathways. And the difference between those two is that for the reference concentration pathways, we just look at the forcing. So they were selected based on their climate forcing, or that means on their impact on the climate system. So there was no idea of making them in any way realistic, or having any storyline attached to them. Whereas for these new SSPs, we do have storylines. So they have been constructed the other way around. So they have started from, we look at how population evolves, we look how economics evolve, we look how energy consumption evolves. So all this information has been condensed and then put into scenarios. So these are just stories. I mean, how could the world evolve during the next 100 years? And then you see there are different storylines that have been selected. The one in the lower left here is maybe the thing which everybody would like to have. It's a nice world, not warming too much. Everybody is nice and polite to each other. And the one in the upper right is probably more what we're doing right now. So it's but everything is possible in this framework. So how does the temperature then evolve if we take these different scenarios? And this is a plot similar to the one I showed before, but this time I just start plotting in 1980, and you see the end of the historical period in black, and then you see the different scenarios in different colors. And do we have a pointer somewhere? Where did it go? Yeah, okay, good, thanks. Okay, and I mean, it's a bit surprised. So if we look at this SSP 585, which has the highest climate forcing, we get a strong warming, and the units here are warming since the pre-industrial period. Okay, so this is what is often expressed to as what we often compare against. So pre-industrial would be 0, and then we have maybe 6 degrees warmer than pre-industrial in the warmest. Whereas if you look at this SSP 119, the green line here, it just barely makes the 2-degree level. And this SSP 119 has been selected because it would follow the Paris Agreement. So this is a scenario that has been designed to be compatible with the Paris Agreement. And the goal of the Paris Agreement is, of course, to keep the world at maybe 1.5 degree warming. And we see that in our model, at least, we do not really make 1.5 degrees, but we maybe make 2 degrees with that scenario. It's good. Now, it's interesting to compare these results against what we had in CMIP 5, because these SSPs, they're still tied to the CMIP 5 things. If you look at the last 2 numbers here, so this is 8.5 watts per square meter as radiative forcing. And that could be compared against the RCP 8.5 that you had for CMIP 5. It's the same radiative forcing, but maybe the distribution is a bit different, regional distribution. But when we compare that against the model that we use for CMIP 5 with the old forcing that we use for CMIP 5, then we see we get the dashed lines in the same color. So with the RCP 8.5, we had a warming of about 5 degrees, whereas now we are above 6 degrees. So something has happened between CMIP 5 and CMIP 6. And this is, the question has been asked this morning. I mean, it's climate sensitivity. Yes, climate sensitivity has changed. So we have a higher climate sensitivity. So our model gets warmer for the same amount of greenhouse gas forcing that we put into it. But it's not only that, it's also that the forcing data sets have changed. That's in a way a flaw of the CMIP 6 design, that we change both the model and the forcing at the same time. So it's very hard now to disentangle what's the reason for this change actually in the warming. But the general pictures, and I mean, these are results that are only based on one model now. So it would now be interesting to take all the CMIP 6 models and in a way make this multi-model ensemble to make sure that all the models agree on that. Okay, I see time is running out. I was too optimistic here. But let me just use the last few minutes to talk about something that we are also doing. We now have this nice model. We make the CMIP 6 simulations, and we then said, oh, can we do something more? And one of the ideas that we had earlier this year was then, yeah, let's make it a large ensemble. I mean, we have seen there's a big variability. Different model runs give different results when you start from different initial conditions. So let's make a large ensemble of simulations. And we decided to go for 50 members and repeat some of the CMIP 6 experiments. And we do it for 4 different scenarios, now shown here. And the reason why we do that is, of course, we want to study the internal variability. I mean, where does it come from? What makes the model vary so much? But we would also like to use this large ensemble to have a larger sample, because if you look, for example, at extremes, extreme events, they happen very rarely by definition. So if you now have 50 members, we have a 50 times bigger chance to cover and be able to study extreme events. This is good. And there's also a link from this here now to Daniel's project that he presented before, this convection permitting stuff. So if we have now these global runs, these 50 members of global runs, so we can select specific members of these large ensemble to downscale later with this convection permitting regional model to so we get more interesting cases. Okay, thank you very much.
Questions for Klaus?
Thank you. That was a very instructive talk. Would you be able to, you talked about change in forcing between CMIP 5 and CMIP 6. Would you be able to explain a little bit of what's behind that?
Not really. because I mean what we did is we did it very mechanically. We just took what the CMIP6 panel has provided as forcing data. So these are the forcing data you have to use to make the CMIP6. So we did that, we applied that, and then later, after we have looked at the results, we discovered that the model gets much warmer now. And so we now start analyzing what's happening actually. What I already heard is, for example, that the CO2 concentrations in the SSP 585 is higher than it is in the corresponding RCP 8.5. And it has been partly compensated by lower methane concentrations. So something was done to these forcing data sets, but we don't know the details yet, and so we have to dig into that.
Well, I'm also confused about the statement about the difference in the forcing, mainly because of the nomenclature that you still have an 8.5 attached to the high scenario forcing, and maybe there's a difference between the amount of methane versus CO2, but the radiative efficiency of methane versus CO2 is really pretty slight. So if it's really 8.5, there's no real reason that you should get much of an effect from the difference. But are you actually saying that the thing labeled 8.5 does not actually have 8.5 watts per square meter of radiative forcing in 2100? Is that?
That could be, because I mean this 8.5 have been derived in integrated assessment models.
Yeah.
And so we would need to know more in detail what these integrated assessment models have been doing, because it's very hard to get these numbers out from the real climate models later on, because there are feedback processes play a role and everything, and how well these have been, or these are represented in the integrated assessment models determines very largely about what forcing you get at the end. So it is, I would say there's a good chance that what is sold as 8.5 watts per square meter forcing is not 8.5 watts per square meter in reality. But maybe Thorsten has other comments on that. No, we don't know simply. I mean, this is really a little bit hidden in the CMIP community, where these scenarios, or how exactly these scenarios have been derived.
I also want to remark that, I mean, terrifying as those 8.5 scenarios look in terms of 5 or 6 degrees warming, it's even worse than it looks, because at 2100 you're emitting about 20 gigatons a year of carbon as CO2. If it takes another 100 years to get down to zero, you're going to double that warming from what you have at 2100. It's truly existential risk.
Yeah, it's a bit puzzling that almost all models, as far as I've heard, have a higher sensitivity. And there's been some rumors that almost all models have done the same to the cloud physics in the models. Could that be a reason, or have you done this sort of in isolation from the model developments of the other models?
No, okay. One thing, I mean, the results when you do these climate projections are, of course, a combination of the forcing data and of the climate sensitivity. Okay, so both can contribute to this extra warming compared to CMIP 5. Now, when we isolate the climate sensitivity, that is by definition only due to increase in carbon dioxide and nothing else, then we just see in our model it has increased from 3.3 to 4.3 about. And in our model we have some good ideas why this has happened. So it was a change in the description of the interaction between aerosols and clouds. Largely explains this increase. However, this is true for our model, and I cannot really say what other models have been doing, but I'm pretty sure that most models have done something to their aerosol description, because the aerosol forcing has changed quite a bit between CMIP 5 and CMIP 6. So I'm pretty sure that many models have done something, improved processes, changed something that just has increased the sensitivity, which may be too high now. I mean, compared to observations, yes, it's possible. So, but again, I mean, this is just from the problem of doing two changes at the same time. So changing the forcing and changing the model at the same time. So we just don't have a clear comparison. We cannot really pinpoint where the problems are. Yeah.
It's very difficult for those who summarize the budget in 6th century, because it will all be much more than was the foundation for the first.
Yeah.
This will be tricky.
It will. It will.
I was just wondering, in terms of comparing what you're getting out now compared to a couple of years ago with your new model, what sort of new extremes or new rare compound events are you able to model now that you could not in the previous iteration?
Oh, okay. I mean, this is for the large ensemble. So what we aim at in rare compound events is, I mean, a compound event is something that combines different rare events. Okay, so for example, we have snow on the ground, heavy precipitation, and warm temperatures. And that doesn't happen very often. But if we now have 50 realizations of the model, we have a much larger data set. So we have chances to have these events, so we can study them. Before, maybe we had one event, and yeah, then you never know how likely is that, and are you really sure that this is representative? Now we may have 10 events, so we have 10 times more data to analyze. So that's why I said compound events, we have a better grasp on them.
Yeah, but I would just, you have to end that here. I would just add to that, so about 5 years ago, we did something similar at the Max Planck Institute. We ran 100 simulations of the historical, and it really changed the way we think about how we analyze the model, internal variability and all of that. So before you all leave, Eva has asked for the word, but let's just thank Klaus again.